It's very unfortunate, but I don't think this is something where we're going to see an immediate ceasefire anytime soon, simply because it is in neither Israel nor its Western backers' interest to see one.
Welcome to the ELIAMEP podcast series. In this podcast, I have the pleasure to discuss with Tahani Mustafa. She is the senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group, where she works on issues including security and socio-political and legal governance in the West Bank, about what is going on in Gaza, what is going on between Israel and the Palestinians and Palestine, Israel and Hamas. Thank you very much, Tahani, for having this discussion with me about such a difficult issue, which is prolonging the crisis in the Middle East. And I want to begin our discussion with something that you said in October, a few days after the terrorist attack of Hamas against Israel. You said in an interview that it is unclear that bombardment and incursions in the north will destroy Hamas or its operational capacity, even if Israel does succeed in destroying all of Hamas' tunnel network there. Now, so many months after, what do you think is the goal of Israel? Because we see what is happening in Gaza, the deaths, the hunger. What will be the day, what Gaza will look the day after? Because I really can't imagine, and I can't imagine how all this will end.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Look, I very much stand by that assessment. And I think, many, even those that were potentially skeptical that Hamas would be able to really undergo a war of attrition here, are very much now echoing the same sentiment, which is that Israel so far has failed to qualify any of its military objectives it set out at the start of this onslaught. Now, if Israel had maybe potentially stuck to targeting Hamas militarily, instead of going after the movement as a political and social movement as well, there are many ways this could have been done without leading to the complete and utter devastation that we've seen in Gaza, where we have now seen Gaza completely razed from the ground up. What's worse is that while Gaza has been turned into a complete uninhabitable wasteland, Israel has not managed to destroy Hamas, neither militarily, socially, or politically. And even in areas of the north where it started at this campaign, and where it claimed to have cleared out huge pockets of the north from Hamas's control, we've actually heard and seen places where Hamas has managed to reestablish itself as both a military and even governing entity. And the same thing in the south. I think something like 80% of Hamas's tunnel infrastructure is still very much intact. And what's worse for Israel is that Hamas has managed to recruit more fighters since the 7th of October. Now, a lot of people, a lot of commentators, especially Israeli and Western commentators, appear to be peddling the Israeli government's line that they don't have a goal for Gaza, that there is no end goal, they have no end vision. And I think to some extent, that is a serious oversimplification of the kind of nuanced reality, the nuances in the changes to reality that we've seen Israel create on the ground in Gaza. I think certainly Israel does have an objective here, which is a continuation of its policy on Gaza since 2007, which is to make it completely uninhabitable. I think since the 7th of October, we've seen that policy accelerate at a much greater speed. We had human rights organizations, the UN itself had warned that under Israel's blockade since 2007, that the Gaza Strip would be completely unfit for human habitation by 2020. We are now 2024. And that was already the case. Gaza's civic infrastructure was barely able to keep itself together. 50% of the population, if not more, were dependent on food aid. Gaza was really just holding on by a thread. People were desperate. Even Hamas, as a political entity, got desperate. The status quo was completely untenable, which is the rationale. According to their own words and own manifesto they later put out to explain why they did what they did on the 7th of October. It was a movement that felt that it had been put in the corner and of people on the verge of desperation. And so I think this is certainly an extension of a long-stated Israeli objective of trying to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. Now, the predicament for Israel today is that given that Gaza has, as I said, been razed from the ground up, the question is, how do you actually achieve that? How do you achieve that objective of continuing to make Gaza uninhabitable, unfit for the population, while trying to minimize the level of casualties that Israel has experienced in this onslaught? Israel does not want ground presence. Its troops are not faring well when it comes to ground insurgency. It can't continue the military campaign that's ongoing, because Israel has turned into an international pariah. This has been a complete PR disaster for Israel, internationally speaking, where we've seen vast amounts of public support that has come out for Palestinians, where we're now starting to see the international community, international institutions, even states that are now starting to turn in terms of their political leanings in this conflict, and where we're seeing more and more support coming out for the Palestinian cause.
Well, what do you think happened? What happened after the Oslo Accords, where everyone was so optimistic? Is it a problem because Hamas is the head of the Palestinians and Netanyahu the head of Israel? Is there a point that when you have Hamas and you have Netanyahu, there is no solution?
Well, look, I don't think anyone who really had a realistic understanding of what the Oslo Accords were, and who understood the Israeli vision of peace from previous peace agreements that had been put on the table from Israel. I don't think anyone really realistically, anyone who had a political understanding, of what the process was in support over Oslo. The majority of Palestinians in the occupied territories were not happy with many of the conditions that Oslo laid out. If anything, they recognized that this would severely restrict what was meant to be temporary. In any case, Oslo was only meant to be a 5-year interim period before final status negotiations. But many Palestinians in the occupied territories were not happy with the accords themselves. They understood that this would mean that they no longer had the freedom of movement that they did, where once they could, they had the ability to travel all across Israel, and now suddenly they're limited to small pockets in the West Bank and in Gaza. Many were very skeptical whether this would actually be an interim period. And what was more, you had prominent, at that time, Palestinian political and historical figures that were coming out criticizing these Oslo Accords, basically saying that, Yasser Arafat and his Fatah movement have literally signaled the death of any potential hope for a Palestinian state. And unfortunately, 3.5 decades later, they were absolutely right with that prediction. Even the late Edward Said was one of the most vocal opponents of the Oslo Accords. Hanan Ashrawi, I remember in one of her in one of her recollections speaking to Arafat as to why he would agree to something like this. He made it very clear to her they were desperate. The PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, that's meant to be the umbrella movement that represents Palestinians worldwide, were desperate financially, politically. They were desperate. That desperation is what led them to sign on. So that's not really a peace process, right? In retrospect, when you think about it, Oslo was not a peace process. When you have one side, the Israelis and the Americans, dictating the terms of an agreement to another side, that is not a peace process. That is capitulation. And since then, that's exactly what it's been, where Palestinians have seen over the last 3.5 decades since the loss of more and more territory, of more and more land, of more natural resources, the loss of more and more of their freedoms, more and more of their political rights. We talk about Gaza being blockaded since 2007. That's simply not true. Gaza was actually under a blockade through the signing of these Oslo Accords. Gaza has been completely cut off from the West Bank. They have had an entirely different kind of permit system. If you want to go from Gaza to the West Bank, you need a permit from the Israelis and permission. Gaza was already subjected to quite a heavy blockade. Now, after 2007, that obviously intensified far, far worse when Hamas took over. So, there were many reasons why Oslo fell apart, but ultimately that is what it was. It was really just this operationalization of what had been, and I use this term, quite stringently, the Israeli vision of peace, which is to offer the Palestinians autonomy, but not self-determination, where you would unload the governing responsibilities of a population Israel did not want, which were the Palestinians, onto an international local entity so they could provide basic service delivery like education, health, security, while still retaining full control of the land, which is exactly what Oslo did. Israel still has full control, sovereign control over the occupied territories, land, air, sea space, natural resources. Since 1994 until today, the number of settlers and settlements has tripled. When Oslo was signed, you had 150,000 settlers in the occupied territories. Today, that number has gone up to 750,000. Now, when we talk about the takeover, the takeover of Hamas, Hamas is not leading the Palestinian national movement. Hamas came to power through a protest vote. People elected Hamas through a protest vote. And I think what is interesting here, and especially since the 7th of October, is that Western countries and Western media have conveniently undergone a process of complete historical amnesia, where they will not tell you that actually those elections in 2006, Fatah, the governing party at the time, were put under pressure from the Americans, especially the Americans, but also the Europeans, to undergo a process of elections. And Fatah had warned them that they would not win those elections. People were discontented with Fatah, with their malpractices, with their poor governance record, with the fact that this supposed quote-unquote peace process had brought Palestinians nothing, that the peace process was pretty much stagnant, that what was meant to be a 5-year interim period had already reached a decade into the process. And still there was...
But after that, Hamas didn't, the Palestinians never voted again.
Well,
and Fatah was corrupt, but I think Hamas is also very corrupt.
Look, no one denies that Hamas are corrupt. So when Hamas won that election, they won it on the basis of a reform bloc, right? So that was a protest vote. And that was something that even the US had said to Fatah, that Hamas has to participate in those elections to give them credibility. Now, when Hamas had won, before they were able to form a unity government the very next day after those elections, all of their legislative council members were arrested by Israel. And then we saw the Western-backed premeditated coup against the democratically elected government of Hamas that was frontlined by Fatah, where they lost control of Gaza and Hamas remained in Gaza. And then you had Fatah in the West Bank. Now, since then, there has been no process to support any kind of democracy or democratic process since in the occupied territories. 2021 was, I think, the first time that you had a serious attempt at elections. And again, there was absolutely no support from Western countries. They refused to provide any logistical support, such as sending, electoral monitors, supporting electoral monitoring bodies. A lot of diplomatic missions, a lot of Western states refused to even try and support, just through rhetoric, to support the process of elections. Why? Because they were fearful that either Hamas would win or some other entity similar that would, you'd have an unpredictable result like 2006. So they were absolutely adamant on not supporting this process. There was no pressure on Israel to allow for elections to take place in East Jerusalem, which is the reason why those elections were cancelled, or at least the pretext Mahmoud Abbas gave. There was no conditionality on Mahmoud Abbas to force him to allow these elections to take place. And I remember even doing the advocacy around this. I remember doing a lot of advocacy at the time, where even our organization was backing this process of elections. Why? Because for the first time, you had almost 99% voter registration. For the first time, you had far more independent leftist lists than you did established political factions. Hamas was not going to win those elections. Neither was Fatah, by the way, which is why Fatah cancelled those elections. Hamas and Fatah even came to a deal to ensure that Hamas would not win a majority. And I'll go on to the reasons why. But they came to a deal between themselves before these elections were announced, which is why they were then announced, that Fatah would secure a majority through a change in the electoral system that would guarantee that Hamas would not secure a victory like it did in 2006, where you had a mixed system. And so changing it to a pure PR system would guarantee a Fatah victory. And what was more was that to guarantee that Mahmoud Abbas would allow for presidential elections, Hamas promised not to frontline a single presidential candidate. So he would go through those elections completely uncontested. And it was because of that deal that his own party was so discontent, because they felt like this was a complete sham. They felt like it was a complete sham that would just basically re-establish Mahmoud Abbas's power. So his own party split into three different lists. And you had Nasser al-Qudwa, Yasser Arafat's nephew, who came out vocally trying to lay out that this was a complete sham, that Mahmoud Abbas was not serious about these elections. That's why he frontlined and supported someone like Marwan Barghouthi to basically disrupt those plans. And then you had Hamas, who had its own interests in trying to enter an agreement like this, which was to basically relinquish its control of governance in Gaza. So Hamas wants a stake in Palestinian politics. It wants its representation and a stake in broader Palestinian decision-making when it comes to things like self-determination, liberation, and how to actually achieve those things. But it doesn't want any governing responsibility. It doesn't want control of the PA. Why? Because under Oslo, the PA and the PLO are two different institutions. The PA is a service delivery body. That's all. It's just a body that's meant to provide education, health, and security to 5.5 million Palestinians in the occupied territories. The PLO is meant to be the body that's charged with liberation and self-determination and diplomacy and foreign politics. And that is the body that Hamas wants, some kind of serious representation and say in. And it had realized that its record in governance in the last 15 years had been disastrous for the movement. It made it deeply unpopular with Palestinians. It was starting to split the movement itself. So it had been a complete disaster. Hamas recognized that. And so it wanted to relinquish its governing responsibility. And this position, by the way, it has not changed. Even today, it is now trying to actively work with different factions in order to find a legitimate way it can hand over governance of Gaza in a way that again, is representative of different segments of Palestinians and is not going to guarantee that you have Mahmoud Abbas basically running Gaza the way that he is running the West Bank, where decision-making is relegated in the hands of one man and his two lieutenants.
But all of that, it's so pessimistic. I mean, that's a vicious circle. And US in the European Union has failed miserable to help. And so how is it going to work out? How is it going to, what the future looks like? And I don't mean only for the Palestinians, of course, for the Palestinians primary, but also for the Israelis, for the people of Israel.
I think it is a very pessimistic and bleak outlook. But, unfortunately, what we have is a conflict where a lot of these stakeholders, whether you're talking about the Palestinian leadership or the Israelis or the international community, have not been acting in good faith. That is ultimately what it is. They have a solution. It's just not the right solution to this conflict. And I think the 7th of October has really sort of dismantled a lot of the facade around a lot of the rhetoric, especially the rhetoric that Israel and the international community have been peddling for God knows how long now, since 1948 even, where we can now see that, states like the US are not impartial brokers, that the Europeans themselves are not impartial brokers, that Israel is not a good faith actor, where it will enter into an agreement and then suddenly find leeways or even just outright backpedal and not respect the terms of those agreements, which is why today we are incapable of reaching a ceasefire. Because as much as Western media likes to present the problem as Hamas basically derailing every potential attempt at a ceasefire, that's simply not true. And we saw that with the American plan, where Hamas neither accepted nor agreed to it. They asked for guarantees from the US that Israel would not backpedal on any terms of the agreement, as they did back in November. When we saw the humanitarian pause, but we still saw the limitations of the amounts of aid that were going in. We still saw people prevented from returning back to their homes in the north, and anyone who did try to go were killed. So there were numerous ways that Israel managed to find leeways out of that pause, and they don't want that to happen again.
But Hamas knew when she did a terrorist attack on the 7th of October, they knew that they would be creating a chaos that would eventually drive many Palestinians to death and hunger and what we see now. And that's why I don't understand why do something so extreme.
I mean, look, I don't really think that's on Hamas to bear. I think they definitely did expect a response, but not the type of response that we've seen. I don't think anyone really expected the type of response we saw. And ultimately, I mean, look, Hamas had a vision for what that operation should have been. Now, what it ended up turning into is, I mean, again, this is not to justify the 7th of October, but what ended up happening on the 7th of October doesn't appear to be what Hamas had been training itself for the last, over the last year. And, I don't think we'll ever get the details of what happened on the 7th of October at this rate. I mean, it's been 9 months in, and there is still so much that we don't know. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Israel is just simply refusing to allow independent investigators to go in and actually really figure out or conduct any kind of serious forensic investigation. Now, we also know that there were more than just Hamas involved in that 7th of October attack. So we know that, Hamas had only alerted other factions like Islamic Jihad and other splinter groups 30 minutes into the operation. And that seems to be where things obviously went wrong, especially when you had thousands of Gazans who also breached the security barrier. As I said, we still don't know the full details of the 7th of October, and that is not in any way to justify what happened, but it doesn't appear to be in their calculation. And this is something Hamas has said itself, that this was not something that they had premeditatedly planned. Now, their plan was to go in, take hostages, go back to Gaza. Obviously, what unfolded was something else entirely. And what was worse was the fact that when they did go back into Gaza, Hamas had tried to, the first thing they tried to do was to enter into negotiations. They've been trying to negotiate since the 7th of October. And it even leaked in Israeli press, by the way, in I think it was Haaretz that put out the report, that Netanyahu had refused nine negotiations that Hamas had put forward. And at one point, they were willing to hand over all hostages for barely nothing on the simple condition that the IDF not enter into Gaza. And he outright refused. The Israeli establishment were hell-bent on revenge, and this was something that even Israeli analysts are saying today, that this vengeance-driven campaign cannot go on because it's completely irrational now, and it has turned Israel into an international pariah.
Are you at all optimistic about EU or the United States finding a way out of this? I mean, as long as Joe Biden is president, because after November, we don't know what is going to happen in the United States also.
I mean, look, I don't think anyone is expecting this to be reconciled in the hands of the United States, whether you're talking about a Biden administration or any other U.S. administration. I mean, it's under successive U.S. administrations that this conflict has been allowed to continue since 1948 until now. The U.S. has proven time and time again that it is not an impartial broker into this conflict. So if we're talking about allowing for Israel's onslaught, I mean, the option now is either Biden or Trump. And as we've seen through Trump's own electoral campaign, I don't think anyone can assume that under Trump we're going to see any kind of immediate ceasefire or pressure on Israel to hold back. And so, it's very unfortunate, but I don't think this is something where we're going to see an immediate ceasefire anytime soon, simply because it is in neither Israel nor its Western backers' interest to see one. Israel will continue to do what it thinks it can get away with, so as long as it can continue to get away with it. And so far, we've seen that the international community, unfortunately, especially the US, have not put any red lines for Israel. And when they do, somehow those goalposts keep shifting. The Rafah invasion was a really good example of that, where at first we were told that the red line for the US would be any invasion of Rafah. And then suddenly when that invasion happens, the US backpedals and says any major invasion of Rafah, right? So it's almost like the goalposts are just continuously shifting. And until then, it's very unlikely we're going to see a ceasefire. We unfortunately now have two sides that are demanding mutually exclusive things. Israel wants the total and complete destruction of Hamas as a political, social, and military movement. And Hamas want to see a complete and total permanent cessation of hostilities. And unfortunately, there is nothing at the moment that can bridge either two sides.
Well, I think that Hamas also wants that. That's what they said in the past, that they don't want Israel to exist, that also creates problems.
Look, Hamas's original charter in 1988 was deeply problematic. No one refutes that. But they did change that charter in 2017, again, not to justify their position prior to that. But in that time, I mean, even 2006, their entering those elections was a clear signal that they were recognizing the agreements the PLO had made with Israel by simply entering the very institutions that those agreements had created. In 2007, they openly stated that they made the distinction between Judaism and Zionism. They recognized a two-state solution, a state on the 1967 borders. That is a state that is the two-state solution. Now, what Hamas have refused to do is to recognize Israel's right to exist. So it's not that it doesn't recognize Israel exists. It does. It's a movement that has a very sober assessment of reality. It recognizes Israel exists, and it's a reality that you Palestinians will simply have to grapple with. However, they refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. Now, we can refute whether that's morally right or wrong all we want, but I think what tends to not be considered in this argument is the fact that Israel, never in its history has it ever recognized Palestinian right to exist. It doesn't even recognize Palestinians as any kind of deserving political entity, which is why the concept of self-determination doesn't factor into any kind of Israeli political calculation. That condition, by the way, has never been put on Israel to recognize the right of Palestinians to exist. That's never a condition that they've ever had to accept. In 1993, when Yasser Arafat had to recognize Israel's right to exist, that reciprocation never came from Israel. And even today, you have a government, a right-wing government, that has openly refused to recognize any of the previous agreements Israel has made with the PLO. What's more, this government does not abide by a single quartet condition that the international community put on Hamas in order to take Hamas out of the isolation that it's been under for the last 15 years. And yet we didn't see a single a single word of condemnation, never mind a single element of pressure on this Israeli government to abide by any of those same conditions. So I think we have to recognize the double standard here, where we can condemn one side for not recognizing the right of one side to exist, but yet the other side is allowed to do so with complete impunity, and that has come with fatal consequences for Palestinians. Prior to the 7th of October, by the way, 2021 to 23 was the deadliest year for Palestinians since the Second Intifada. And that was something that even the UN and Human Rights Watch have now put out a report where it details the level of impunity where Palestinians were literally being killed with complete impunity and absolutely no legal justification for it. And it has been the absolute worst since 2005, where search and arrest operations in the West Bank prior to the 7th of October, and this is the West Bank, by the way, totaled something like 500 a week at minimum, where you had 184 cases of settler violence per day in the West Bank, a population that had nothing to do with the 7th of October. When Fatah and the PA came out and condemned the 7th of October, the West Bank was immediately put under economic sanctions and complete restrictions to their freedom of movement. And that has remained until today, by the way, where you have seen, since 7th of October alone, never mind the last 2 years, over 550 Palestinians killed just through search and arrest operations and settler violence.
Tahani Mustafa, thank you so much for this discussion and for helping us see the whole picture about what is happening in the Middle East, about what is happening in Gaza, in this ongoing crisis, war between Palestinians and Israelis. I thank you very, very much. It was Tahani Mustafa, Senior Palestine Analyst at the International Crisis Group. Thank you. This was another ELIAMEP podcast with Οντίν Λιναρδάτου. Recording, editing, and sound editing by Yota Bouga. Follow us on the ELIAMEP channels on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and elsewhere.